The front wheels of Brenda's pristine, pearl-white luxury SUV lifted 2 feet off the asphalt while she stood in the street, literally stomping her sensible walking shoes like a toddler. I leaned against my porch column with a glass of iced tea and a thick folder of original property deeds, watching this tyrannical Homeowners Association president realize her absolute authority had just vanished. She had spent 6 months plotting to steal my work truck and fine me into bankruptcy over a parking spot, completely unaware she was triggering a contractual trap that would cost her $10,000 and her own house. My name is Mark. I am a 35-year-old custom cabinet maker, and I just wanted peace at the dead end of my street. But before I tell you how a faded map from 1998 legally forced this woman to pack her bags, we have to go back to the morning I woke up to an empty driveway. Because if you are going to use the fine print to ruin a man, you better make sure you actually own the ground you are standing on. Look, everyone has a story about a bad neighbor. You know the type. The guy who mows his lawn at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, or the lady whose dog uses your prized petunias as a personal bathroom. But I am willing to bet every single penny in my bank account that my neighbor Brenda could make Satan himself ask for a transfer to a different department. Brenda was not just a Karen. She was the final boss of Karens. She was the Homeowners Association president, and she wore that title like a heavily decorated war general. If you looked up the word entitled in the dictionary, you would just find a picture of Brenda holding a clipboard and a lukewarm vanilla latte, glaring at a slightly overgrown patch of grass. I need to set the scene for you so you understand just how absurd this entire situation was. I live in a quiet little subdivision that was built back in the late 1990s. The houses are nice, mostly 2-story brick places, but they are packed together like sardines in a very boring beige can. I bought my place about 5 years ago because it had one massive advantage. It sat right at the end of the neighborhood, bordering a large patch of woods, and technically, my driveway connected to a stretch of road that dead-ended at my property line. I am a contractor. I build custom cabinets and do high-end kitchen remodels. This means I drive a work truck. It is a 3/4-ton heavy-duty pickup truck. It is loud. It is usually covered in a fine layer of sawdust, and it is my absolute baby. I needed to feed myself and pay my mortgage. Now, our neighborhood has an HOA. I know. First mistake, but when I bought the house, the HOA was practically invisible. The dues were low, maybe $50 a month, and they mostly just paid to keep the entrance sign looking nice and the snow plowed in the winter. No one cared if you painted your door red or left your garbage cans out an extra day. It was paradise. Then, Brenda retired. Brenda had previously worked as some sort of middle management paper pusher for a corporate logistics firm. She was a woman who clearly thrived on micromanaging people who could not fight back. When she retired, she suddenly had 24 hours a day of free time and absolutely zero hobbies. She did not knit. She did not garden. Her hobby became us. She ran for HOA president unopposed because, let us be honest, no normal person actually wants to be the HOA president. The second she got that imaginary gavel, a dark cloud descended over our street. Let me paint a picture of Brenda for you. She was roughly 50 years old, but her aura was a solid 85. She drove a pristine, pearl-white luxury SUV that looked like a bloated marshmallow on wheels. She had this short, aggressive haircut that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager of this universe." And her voice. Oh man, her voice. It sounded like a cheese grater rubbing against a chalkboard. It was this nasally, condescending whine that immediately made your blood pressure spike. Her husband, Gary, was a spineless lump of a man who mostly just trailed behind her carrying a tape measure. Yes, a literal tape measure. They would walk the neighborhood every Tuesday and Thursday evening, measuring the height of people's grass to ensure it was exactly 2.5 inches. If it was 3 inches, you got a brightly colored warning sticker slapped onto your mailbox. Not in your mailbox, which is a federal crime, but slapped onto the side with industrial-grade adhesive that required a blowtorch and a prayer to remove. From day one, Brenda hated me. Why? Because I was not a corporate drone. I worked with my hands, and most importantly, I parked my big, dusty work truck on the street right in front of my house. Now my driveway is short, barely long enough to fit my personal car, a little sedan I use for running errands. The truck had to go on the street. But here's the thing. My house is at the end of the road. No one drives past my house. Parking my truck there bothered absolutely no one. It did not block traffic. It did not block fire hydrants. It just sat there, minding its own business, full of power tools and honest labor. But to Brenda, my truck was an insult to her very existence. It did not fit the aesthetic of her beige, sterile kingdom. The first time she confronted me, I was under the hood of the truck, checking the oil. I heard the aggressive clacking of her sensible walking shoes marching up the asphalt. "Excuse me," she squawked. Her tone was the audio equivalent of a wet blanket. "We do not allow commercial vehicles to be parked on the neighborhood streets. It brings down the property values and looks extremely trashy." I wiped my hands on a rag, stood up, and tried to be polite. I really did. I smiled and said, "Hi, Brenda. It is a public street, and this is my primary vehicle. I need it for work. It is perfectly legal to park here." Her face immediately scrunched up like she had just taken a massive bite out of a raw lemon. The HOA bylaws clearly state that all vehicles must be parked in garages or approved driveways. The street is HOA property, and as president, I am telling you to move this monstrosity. I took a deep breath. "Brenda, my truck does not fit in my garage. My garage is full of woodworking equipment, and my driveway is too short. Unless you want it sticking out into the road and actually blocking traffic, it stays parallel, parked right here against the curb." She glared at me, her eyes darting to the sawdust on my boots. "We will see about that." That was the beginning of the war. Over the next 6 months, Brenda made it her life mission to make me miserable. She sent me letters, so many letters. I had a stack of them on my kitchen counter that was at least 3 inches thick. Each letter was typed on official-looking HOA letterhead, citing obscure bylaws about community visual standards and street-side aesthetics. Every time she walked by my house, she would glare at the truck, take out a little notebook, and furiously scribble something down. It was completely unhinged. I felt like I was living next to a government informant who was absolutely obsessed with Ford pickups. She even tried to rally the other neighbors against me. She hosted a block party, which I was conveniently not invited to, and spent the entire time complaining about how my truck was going to invite crime into the neighborhood. Yes, because hardened criminals are deeply attracted to a truck full of heavy, difficult-to-steal table saws. Most of the neighbors just ignored her. They liked me. I fixed their squeaky doors for free. But Brenda was relentless. Then came the week of hell. I had just landed a massive contract to build custom library shelving for a very wealthy client across town. It was the kind of job that was going to pay off my truck loan and put a huge chunk of change into my savings account. I was working 14-hour days, coming home exhausted, covered in stain and wood glue, and just crashing into bed. It was a Tuesday morning. I woke up at 5:30, made my coffee, grabbed my lunch cooler, and walked out my front door. I looked toward the street. Empty. My brain did not process it at first. You know that feeling when you look at something completely wrong and your brain just tries to buffer? I blinked. I rubbed my eyes. The space in front of my house where my truck had been parked for 5 years was completely empty. There was just a faint oil stain on the asphalt. Panic hit me like a freight train. My tools, every single tool I owned, my livelihood, my entire business was in that truck. If it was stolen, I was ruined. I dropped my coffee mug on the driveway and sprinted toward the street, looking up and down the road like the truck was playing hide and seek. Nothing. I pulled out my phone to call the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. Just as I brought the phone to my ear, I noticed a bright neon green sticker slapped onto my mailbox. I walked over and ripped it off. It was a formal notice of towing. It stated that the vehicle had been removed by order of the HOA president due to repeated violations of the community street parking covenant. I saw red. I did not just see red, I saw an entire spectrum of violent colors that have not been named yet. Brenda had towed my work truck. She had literally stolen my ability to work. I stormed over to her house. I did not care what time it was. I marched up her pristine driveway, past her stupid garden gnomes, and pounded on her front door. I pounded so hard, the frosted glass rattled in the frame. A minute later, the door swung open, and there stood Gary, wearing a plaid bathrobe and looking like a startled pigeon. "Where is she?" I demanded, not even bothering to say hello. Gary stammered, "She is. Well, Brenda is having her morning tea. Get her." "Now." Brenda appeared behind him, pushing him aside. She was already fully dressed, makeup perfectly applied, looking incredibly smug. It was obvious she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Where's my truck, Brenda?" I was gripping the doorframe to keep myself from throwing a garden gnome through her living room window. "Your commercial vehicle was illegally parked on HOA property," she said, crossing her arms. "You received multiple warnings. As president, I have a duty to uphold the standards of this community. It was removed by a contracted towing company. You can retrieve it from impound once you pay the fines. You had no right. That is a public street," she smiled. A cold, reptilian smile. "Actually, the streets in this subdivision are private property, governed by the master deed of the HOA. We own the streets. We dictate who parks on them. Have a nice day, and I suggest you find a legal place to park from now on." She slammed the door in my face. I was shaking with rage. I called the towing company listed on the back of the neon sticker. They were located halfway across the county in a sketchy industrial park. I had to call a rideshare, which cost me $40, and ride in silence while my blood boiled. When I got to the impound lot, the guy behind the bulletproof glass told me it was going to cost $450 to release the vehicle, plus a storage fee, plus an administrative fee. All in, I was out almost $600 just to get my own property back. I paid it. I had to. I had a client waiting. I drove to work, completely furious, white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire way. My whole day was ruined. I was late, I was angry, and I was out a huge chunk of money. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold drink, staring at the towing receipt. I was not going to let this go. I am a pretty laid-back guy, but when you mess with my money and my tools, you flip a switch. I wanted revenge, but I wanted it to be legal. I wanted it to be permanent. I wanted to crush her absolute authority. Brenda claimed the HOA owned the streets, but something about that bothered me. When I bought my house, my real estate agent had made a passing comment about the property lines being a little weird because my house was technically part of the Phase 2 expansion that the original developer went bankrupt trying to finish. I pulled out my massive folder of closing documents. I am talking about the giant stack of papers they make you sign when you buy a house that no one ever actually reads. I spent 3 hours poring over plat maps, title insurance policies, and property descriptions. The legal jargon was dense, but I started to piece something together. The original developer, a guy named Thomas, had laid out the neighborhood in the 90s. He deeded the streets for the first phase of the neighborhood over to the HOA, but then he went broke. He sold off the remaining unbuilt lots in Phase 2 to different builders. My house was the very last lot at the dead end of the street. I looked closely at the surveyor map. The line that marked the HOA-owned street ended exactly 20 feet before my driveway. The last 20 feet of the road, the dead-end turnaround where I always parked my truck, was not part of the HOA deed. I needed to be absolutely sure. The next morning, I called off work. I drove down to the county clerk office and pulled the original master deeds for the entire subdivision. I paid a very nice clerk named Barbara $20 to help me trace the property lines back to 1998. Barbara laid the massive blueprints out on a table. She traced her finger down the street, right up to my house. "Here's the boundary of the Homeowners Association parcel," Barbara said, tapping a line on the map. "And here is your parcel." "Wait," I said, leaning in. "Who owns that little square of asphalt between the HOA boundary and my property line?" Barbara squinted at the map. She typed some things into her ancient computer. "Well, this is interesting," she muttered. "The developer never deeded this section to the HOA or the city. When you bought your house, the legal description of your lot included this easement. Sir, you do not just own your house. You own this 20-foot section of the street. It is technically your private driveway, even though it looks exactly like the rest of the public road." I stared at her. A slow, evil grin started to spread across my face. "Are you telling me that the spot where my truck was parked yesterday belongs to me? Not the HOA? Not the city?" "Yes," Barbara confirmed. "It is entirely your private property. The HOA has zero jurisdiction over that patch of pavement." My heart started pounding. Brenda had ordered a tow truck onto my private property and stolen my vehicle. That was grand theft auto. But I was not going to just call the cops. That was too easy. Brenda loved rules, contracts, and fine print. I was going to use them to destroy her. I thanked Barbara, bought her a box of donuts from the bakery across the street, and headed home. But I was not done digging. I opened up the HOA bylaws. If Brenda could use these rules as a weapon, so could I. I read every single page, and then, buried on page 47, under a section titled Board Member Conduct and Liability, I found the Holy Grail. It read, "Any member of the Board of Directors found to have committed a felony or found to have grossly violated the property rights of a resident, including illegal trespassing or unauthorized seizure of property, shall be immediately removed from the board. Furthermore, such violations of the Master Covenant constitute a material breach of the residency agreement, granting the association the right to levy punitive fines up to $10,000 or initiate forced sale proceedings to remove the offending party from the community." It was a nuclear option built into the contract to prevent board members from becoming tyrants. The irony was almost too delicious to handle. Brenda had weaponized the bylaws, never realizing they contained a self-destruct button. I needed everything to be bulletproof. Imperfection could ruin this. If I made one mistake, Brenda would wriggle her way out of it with her corporate double-speak. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly preparing. First, I hired a private land surveyor. I paid him $800 to come out, find the iron pins buried in the ground, and spray paint a neon orange line straight across the asphalt, marking the exact boundary where the HOA street ended and my private property began. It looked like a construction line. No one paid attention to it. Second, I bought signs, not the cheap plastic ones from the hardware store. I custom-ordered heavy-gauge aluminum signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense." I bolted them to a metal post right at the property line. I made sure they were visible, legally compliant, and completely undeniable. Third, I needed a towing company. I did not just call any towing company. I called the absolute most ruthless, cutthroat towing operation in the city. A company run by a guy named Earl, who sounded like he smoked 3 packs a day and possessed exactly zero empathy for human suffering. I signed a private property impound contract with Earl. I gave him the survey map, showed him the signs, and told him that if I called him, I wanted the vehicle gone in 10 minutes. Earl grunted his approval. Now, I just needed the bait. I parked my truck in my garage. It barely fit. I had to move my table saw and stack lumber to the ceiling, but I squeezed it in. My personal sedan went into the driveway. The 20-foot stretch of asphalt in front of my house, my private property, was left completely wide open. Brenda took the bait instantly. You see, Brenda and Gary had a lot of vehicles. They had the giant beige SUV, Gary had a midlife crisis sports car, and for some inexplicable reason, they owned a 6-seater, lifted golf cart that they drove around the neighborhood like they were patrolling the border. Because their driveway was full, they constantly parked the golf cart and the SUV on the street in front of other people's houses. Without my truck taking up space at the end of the road, Brenda decided my spot was the perfect overflow parking lot for her fleet. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking a glass of iced tea, watching the neighborhood. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and then I heard the whining hum of the electric golf cart. Down the street came Gary, chauffeuring Brenda in the lifted golf cart. They pulled right past the neon orange line on the asphalt, right past my private property signs, and parked the cart squarely on my pavement. Gary hopped out, leaving the keys in the ignition, and they started walking back toward their house. I stood up. "Hello, neighbors," I called out. Brenda turned, looking at me with absolute disdain. "What do you want?" she snapped. "You cannot park that there," I said, keeping my voice calm and pleasant. "That is my private property." Brenda let out a barking laugh. "Oh, please, we have been over this. The HOA owns the streets. I can park wherever I want. Be grateful I'm just parking a golf cart here and not citing you for having those ugly weeds in your flower bed." She turned around and kept walking. I smiled. I pulled out my phone and dialed Earl. "Hey, Earl," I said, "I have a trespasser." 10 minutes, Earl growled. Exactly 8 minutes later, a massive flatbed tow truck came roaring down the street. It did not have flashing lights, just the raw, diesel-powered rumble of impending doom. The truck backed up to the golf cart with terrifying efficiency. The operator hopped out, hooked the winch to the front axle of the golf cart, and dragged it up onto the bed. It took less than 90 seconds. I watched it drive away. It was a beautiful sight. But I knew the golf cart was not enough to trigger the nuclear option. I needed the SUV. I went back inside and waited. About an hour later, I heard yelling. I looked out the window. Gary was standing in the empty space, looking around frantically. He ran back to his house. 5 minutes later, Brenda came storming down the street. Her face had turned a shade of crimson that usually indicates a stroke, and veins popped in her neck. She was marching so fast, she looked like an Olympic speed walker. She marched right up to my door and started pounding. I opened it, holding my phone. "Where's our golf cart?" she screamed. I leaned against the doorframe. I had it towed. She actually gasped. "You what? You cannot do that. That is our property. You stole our vehicle. I am calling the police." "Please do," I said, gesturing toward the street. "But while you wait for them, you might want to read the signs you parked right next to." She looked at the metal sign. Her eyes narrowed. "You put up an illegal sign on HOA property. You are insane. I am going to have you fined so heavily you will lose this house. You are done. I am going back to get my car, and I am parking it right here until the police arrive." She stormed off. I could not believe my luck. She was going to park the SUV on my property. This was too perfect. 10 minutes later, Brenda drove her massive, pristine, pearl-white luxury SUV down the street. She aggressively pulled into my spot, putting the bumper right over the orange spray paint line. She put the car in park, turned it off, crossed her arms, and sat inside, glaring at my house. I pulled out my phone and called Earl again. "Got another one, Earl," I said. "Same spot." Earl actually chuckled. "Be right there." While Earl was on his way, a local police cruiser rolled down the street. Brenda must have called them the second she realized the golf cart was gone. The cruiser parked behind Brenda SUV. 2 officers got out. One was older, looking tired and annoyed. The other was a younger rookie. Brenda immediately threw open her car door and practically sprinted toward them. "Officers! Thank goodness! This man is a lunatic. He stole our golf cart, he put up illegal signs, and he is threatening me. I am the president of this HOA, and I demand he be arrested for grand theft." The older officer held up a hand. "Okay, ma'am, calm down. Let us get both sides." They walked up to my porch. I walked down the steps to meet them, holding my thick folder of documents. "Good afternoon, officers," I said politely. "What is going on here?" the older officer asked. "Your neighbor claims you stole her vehicle." "I did not steal anything," I replied. I had a trespassing vehicle legally towed from my private property by a licensed contractor. And she is currently trespassing again by parking her SUV right there. Brenda shrieked, "Lies! It is an HOA street. He does not own the street. Arrest him!" I opened my folder. "Officer, I have the original property deeds, a certified county surveyor map, and a freshly painted property line right there on the asphalt." I handed the massive stack of papers to the officer. He sighed, put on his reading glasses, and started looking through them. He looked at the map. He looked at the orange line on the ground. He looked at the sign. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to Brenda, "according to this certified deed, the HOA boundary ends 20 feet back. This section of pavement belongs exclusively to this gentleman. He has it legally posted. He had every right to tow your golf cart." Brenda froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a very angry ghost. "That is impossible. The developer gave the streets to us. We manage all the asphalt." "Not this piece," the officer said, tapping the paper. Just then, the beautiful sound of a diesel engine echoed down the street. Earl tow truck rounded the corner. Earl backed up with precision right toward Brenda pristine white SUV. Brenda panicked. "What is he doing?" "Stop him!" She ran toward the tow truck, waving her arms. Earl ignored her completely. He jumped out, slapped a set of wheel lifts under the front tires of the SUV, and started cranking the hydraulic levers. "You cannot take my car!" Brenda screamed at Earl. "I am the HOA president. I will sue you." Earl looked at her, deadpan. "Lady, I do not care if you were the queen. This is private property." She turned to the cops. "Arrest him. He is stealing my car." The older officer shook his head. "Ma'am, it is a civil matter, and you are parked on private property after being warned. He has a valid tow contract. There is nothing we can do. I suggest you move the car before he lifts it." Brenda ran to the driver's side door and grabbed the handle. But Earl had already engaged the hydraulics. The front wheels of the SUV lifted 2 feet off the ground. The car tilted backward. "Let it down!" Brenda wailed, literally stomping her feet like a toddler denied candy. Earl looked at me. I gave him a thumbs up. "That will be a $250 drop fee, cash only if you want it down right now," Earl told her. "Otherwise, it is going to the lot." "I do not have cash," she yelled. "Then we are going for a ride," Earl said. He climbed back into the cab, put the truck in gear, and drove away, dragging Brenda pride and joy down the street. Brenda stood in the middle of the road, trembling. She looked at me. The sheer hatred in her eyes could have melted steel. "You're going to pay for this. I will call an emergency board meeting tonight. We will fine you into bankruptcy. We will put a lien on your house." I smiled. The trap was fully sprung. "Actually, Brenda," I said, pulling one final piece of paper from my folder, "you might want to cancel that meeting, because according to the bylaws you love so much, you are no longer on the board." She scoffed. "You do not have the power to remove me." I handed her a copy of page 47, the section about board member conduct. "Read it," I said. She snatched the paper out of my hand. Her eyes darted back and forth across the text. "It says right here," I pointed, "that any board member who commits a gross violation of property rights, including illegal trespassing and unauthorized seizure of property, is immediately removed. Last Tuesday, you ordered my truck towed from this exact spot, which we have now legally established is my private property. You trespassed, and you authorized the illegal seizure of my vehicle." She stared at the paper. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "But wait, there is more," I continued, enjoying every single second of her destruction. "The bylaws also state that this constitutes a material breach of your residency agreement, meaning the HOA can levy a $10,000 fine against you or force the sale of your home. And guess what? Since you are no longer the president, the vice president gets to make that call. And here was the kicker. The vice president of the HOA was a guy named Dave. Dave was a retired teacher who hated Brenda just as much as I did. Brenda had fined Dave 4 times because his trash cans were visible from the street for an extra hour after pickup time. Dave was just waiting for a chance to strike. I had already talked to Dave. I had showed him the deeds and the bylaws the night before. Dave was practically giddy with excitement. "This is absurd," Brenda finally managed to squeak out. Her voice was completely hollow. "No, Brenda," I said softly. "This is the rules, and you love the rules." The fallout was swift and absolutely brutal. I filed a formal police report against Brenda for the illegal tow of my truck, citing the surveyor map as proof. The police did not arrest her, but it generated an official police record of her trespassing and illegal seizure of property. I immediately handed that police report over to Dave and the rest of the HOA board. Dave convened an emergency meeting the very next night. The room was packed. Half the neighborhood showed up because word had spread about the golf cart and the SUV getting towed. When Dave stood up and presented the police report, the surveyor documents, and page 47 of the bylaws, the room erupted into cheers. People hated this woman. Brenda tried to defend herself. She tried to claim she was acting in good faith to protect the neighborhood, but Dave just kept hammering her with the fine print. "You violated a resident private property rights," Dave said into the microphone. "You exposed the HOA to massive legal liability. Under the covenants you enforce so strictly, you are hereby stripped of your presidency, removed from the board, and fined $10,000 for material breach of contract." Brenda burst into tears and ran out of the room. Gary scurried out right behind her. But I was not done. I took the police report and my towing receipt from when she towed my truck, and I filed a lawsuit against her in small claims court for the towing fees, lost wages, and emotional distress. Because she had acted outside her legal authority on property the HOA did not own, the HOA insurance would not cover her. She was personally liable. She ended up having to write me a personal check for $2,500. The $10,000 fine from the HOA absolutely broke them. They tried to fight it, but the bylaws were ironclad. They refused to pay, so the HOA board, now led by Dave, initiated the forced sale proceedings. It took about 6 months of legal battling, but eventually the lawyer bills and the pressure became too much. Brenda and Gary put their house on the market. The day the moving truck arrived at Brenda House was like a neighborhood holiday. People were literally sitting on lawn chairs in their driveways, drinking cold beverages, watching the movers carry out her awful beige furniture. Brenda drove her SUV, which she had to pay almost $1,000 to get out of her impound lot, down the street one last time. As she passed my house, I was standing in my driveway next to my dusty, beautiful work truck. I raised a glass of iced tea and a silent toast. She refused to look at me, staring straight ahead with a look of utter defeat. The new neighbors who bought her house are fantastic. They are a young couple with a golden retriever. The dog occasionally digs a hole near my fence, and you know what I do? I patch the hole and give the dog a treat, because that is what normal neighbors do. The HOA is back to being invisible. Dues are still $50 a month. Dave is president, and his entire platform is just leaving people alone. As for my truck, it still sits exactly where it always did, on my private, absolutely legally owned patch of asphalt at the end of the road. Sometimes, when the sun hits the sawdust on the hood just right, I am reminded of Brenda, and I smile. You see, the moral of the story is pretty simple. Do not poke a bear. But more importantly, if you are going to use the rule book to ruin someone's life, you better make absolutely sure you have read every single page of it yourself, because there is always a loophole, and there is always someone petty enough to find it. I am that someone, and I own the street, literally. Now, if you will excuse me, I have some cabinets to build and a big loud truck to load up. And the best part is, I do not have to worry about anyone leaving a brightly colored sticker on my windshield. Because in this tiny corner of the world, I am the law. And the law says, leave my truck alone.